The federal agents of the Bureau of Investigation had joined the hunt for John Dillinger, the outlaw who had escaped from jail twice and evaded police traps and raids so often that it was becoming ridiculous. The public cheered him on, but the heat on John and his fellow gang members, John Red Hamilton, George Babyface Nelson, Homer Van Meter, and Thomas Tommy Carroll, was getting too great. Johnny had just shot his way out of his apartment in St. Paul, Minnesota. The gang's jug maker Eddie Green was killed in a federal ambush, and the feds had arrested Dillinger's girlfriend, Billy Frechette. The gang decided to go to ground somewhere quiet and out of the way. Underworld Tavern owner Louis Cernocchi suggested they go to the Little Bohemia Lodge in northern Wisconsin. I am Yvette, this is Deep Frank History. Thank you for tuning in to episode 9 of the story of John Dillinger. How it started, how it ended, and everything in between. At the end of the long, narrow Nasdar Road in Manitowish Waters, Wisconsin, a hunting and fishing region, lies the 2-story Little Bohemia Lodge, 30 yards from the shores of Little Star Lake. Yep, it's still there. It wasn't fancy, but it was nice. There was a large kitchen, a bar, and a spacious living room downstairs that could be cleared for dancing. There were 10 guest rooms upstairs and some cottages next to the building. Little Bohemia's Lodge's owner was the energetic and outgoing Emil Vanatka, a Bohemian immigrant. After a stint as a bartender for the underworld in Chicago during Prohibition, he opened a restaurant in Racine, Wisconsin. Here, Emil met Nan Laporte from Manitowish Waters, who was delivering her brother's moonshine to the speakeasies. After Emil and Nan got married, they moved to Chicago and opened a restaurant called Little Bohemia. Among his clientele were many underworld figures. In October 1925, their son Emil Jr. was born, and Vanatka decided to trade in the mean streets of Chicago for the mean woods of northern Wisconsin. Emil bought a plot of land and built one of the many tourist lodges in the area and named it Little Bohemia. It was right along an infamous alcohol smuggle route from Canada to Chicago. In 1931, a fire nearly destroyed the lodge, and Vanatka had to remortgage his house to pay for the nearly $10,000 in renovation costs. The new mortgage forced him to remain open during the winter as the only resort in the area. During the brutal Wisconsin winters, his guests were mainly hunters and traveling salesmen, but he offered dinner specials to the locals, and men from the CCC camp at nearby Mercer patronized the bar. The CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps, was a voluntary New Deal work program for unemployed, unmarried young men charged with the preservation of federal, state, and local land. Again, I must point out that the following is based on eyewitness accounts, gangsters' told tales, and law enforcement reports. None can be considered entirely reliable, but it's all we have. Strap in, it's gonna be a wild ride. Early Friday morning, April 20th, 1934, Louis Cernocchi went up to the second floor of his tavern in Fox River Grove, Illinois, to wake up all the gangsters and their moles. He served them an early breakfast, and at 7 a.m., a 4-car caravan left Chicago for the 400-mile trip to the Little Bohemia Lodge in Manitowish Waters, Wisconsin. John Dillinger in his Ford V8 left first with John Hamilton and his girl Pat Sherrington. They'd go into Chicago to pack some more stuff for the trip. Next to leave were Homer Van Meter and his sweetheart Marie Marion Conforti. Conforti, a 21-year-old petite Italian woman, traveled with Rex, a small black Boston bulldog. Pat Riley, the gangster in training, was their driver. Van Meter would arrive first to give the place a once-over, to check if it was safe and map out emergency escape routes. A few minutes after Van Meter left, Nelson and his wife Helen Gillis headed out in a Ford V8 sedan with Kentucky plates. And after they left, Tommy Carroll and his girl Jean Delaney Crompton took off in a black Buick coupe with California plates on loan from Cernocchi. Both Tommy and Jean were separated from their spouses, but they considered themselves married to each other. Oh, and Jean's sister Dolores Delaney was gangster Alvin Karpus's girl. 2 hours into the trip, Nelson ran a red light and crashed into a Chevrolet in Arlington, Wisconsin. The Ford's left side was destroyed and the driver's side mirror was shattered. No one was hurt. Carroll rolled up to the scene, pulled over behind Nelson, and kept the engine running. Uh-oh, was this gonna be another road rage incident? Was trigger-happy Nelson gonna shoot somebody again? No, Nelson managed to keep his temper in check. However, when the two gangsters in fancy cars with fancy moles started to attract a lot of attention, Nelson quickly handed the Chevy driver $83 to get his car fixed and drove his clunker of a Ford to a garage 15 miles down the road. Before the mechanic returned with the repair forms, Jimmy and Helen hopped into Carol's car and disappeared. At about 1 p.m., Homer Van Meter's car turned onto Nasdar Road off Highway 51, passing an imposing wooden arched gateway with a sign that said, Little Bohemia. Pat Riley drove down the long road/driveway toward the Little Bohemia Lodge and backed Homer Van Meter's car into a parking space ready to pull out quickly if necessary. Another car was just leaving, and Riley ran over to ask where the entrance was. Lloyd Laporte, Nan Wanatka's brother, pointed to the main door. As Lloyd drove off, he told his wife, "I bet that car is hot," and shrugged it off. Homer Van Meter greeted the lodge's owner, Emil Wanatka, by name, and Nan instantly knew. Trouble. Please be here for lunch. Please be here for lunch. Well, no such luck. Van Meter asked if Wanatka could put up 10 guests for several days. They had a referral letter, which should arrive soon. Wanatka, though smelling the Chicago stink on his new guests, was happy for the business. Yep, there was plenty of room. Wanatka was wondering, what kind of city slickers would come all the way out here with a party of 10? After lunch, Van Meter cased the place and mentally marked emergency exits. There was only one, the main gate. Van wasn't thrilled with the idea that the whole gang was stuck in the same location, but Emil said that no other lodges were open in the area that time of year. At about 5 p.m., John Dillinger, John Hamilton, and Pat Sherrington pulled into the parking lot. 15 minutes later, Tommy Carroll and Babyface Nelson arrived with their ladies. The party of 10 was complete. They couldn't be more gangster if they tried. Fancy suits, fancy cars, fancy ladies, and tons of heavy luggage on account of all the guns. One of Wanatka's waiters, 16-year-old George Bazzo, lugging a bag into the lodge, groaned, "There must be lead in this one. What are these guys, hardware salesmen?" Nelson handed Wanatka Louis Cernocchi's reference letter, which said that the men were friends who should be well treated. Referrals from Cernocchi meant underworld. But which gang was this? Then Nelson snatched the letter back and violently tore it to pieces, as one does. Damn, son, who are these people? Wanatka assigned 3 bedrooms on the second floor of the main building to Dillinger, Hamilton, and Sherrington, and Van Meter and Conforti, while Nelson and Carroll and their ladies were put into 3-room cabins to the right of the lodge. Nelson complained about Dillinger getting the royal treatment. "Who in the hell does he think he is? We'll put him in the cottage." To him, Dillinger's simple room overlooking the parking lot was somehow superior to the 3-room cottage he got. Johnny said later to Sherrington, "I'd have let the little bastard have the place if he hadn't been such an asshole about it." Yeah, the gang were no fan of Nelson, but he was good at his job, so there's that. Pat Riley ended up bunking with Dillinger, which was equal parts scary and exciting. Johnny and crew were the only guests, but they watched and scrutinized every person who showed up at the lodge, as one does. Nelson instructed staff that their guests would clean their own rooms and strictly forbade anyone from entering their rooms. As one does, wait, no one does that. It was obvious to Emil that these guys were hot, or at least thought they were. So, who were they? Dude, what you don't know, and you don't want to know. That Friday night, the gang enjoyed a steak dinner in the lodge's bar room. Curiously, none of the men drank alcohol. After dinner, the gangsters invited Emil Wanatka to join them for a game of cards. Nan didn't like the looks of any of them and went to the kitchen to talk to her sister Ruth, wife of Henry Voss, the owners of the Birchwood Lodge 2 miles up the highway. When Nan's sister left, she went upstairs to go to bed and fell asleep, after she convinced herself that the men downstairs weren't dangerous. Wanatka tried hard to remember everyone's name. There was Jimmy, Nelson, Wayne, Van Meter, Tom, Carroll, and Johnny, Dillinger. Tom and Jimmy were chatty, but Wayne and Johnny said little. Dillinger won the first round. Score! As he scooped up his winnings, Vanatka got a look inside his jacket. Oh dear. Here are two .45s in shoulder holsters. I got to thinking, who could this be in dead winter with a couple of guns on? Emil casually checked the others for bulging jackets. Sure enough, everyone was packing heat. Who were these men? He studied their faces. So Johnny had a cleft chin and a mole between his eyes. Wait a minute. Emil was like, I need kitchen? In the kitchen, he picked up a Chicago Tribune newspaper. Well, what do you know? On the front page was a photograph of Johnny. John Dillinger, the most wanted man in America. Damn, son. These guys were the hottest in all the land. Vanatka returned to the game, but then excused himself. He was tired? Upstairs, Emil woke Nan. Shut up and don't talk, but I think the man with the dyed red hair is Dillinger. Well, sleep's ruined. All night, Nan jumped whenever she heard her two collies, Shadow and Prince, barking outside. However, they barked at every leaf that moved, so all the time. The gangsters didn't get a full night's rest either. Dillinger, Hamilton, and Van Meter worked 3-hour shifts keeping night watch. The constant floor squeaks, knob turns, and footsteps up and down the hallway turned the long, dark night into a nightmare for Nan. The following morning, after breakfast, Emil pulled Johnny aside. He recalled, I took him into my little office and slammed the door. I looked him right in the eye and said, You're John Dillinger. Johnny didn't even flinch. You're not afraid, are ya? No. Everything I got to my name, including my family, is right here, and every policeman in America is looking for you. If I can help it, there isn't going to be any shooting match. Why don't you do me a favor and you fellas get out? Johnny turned on the Dillinger Charm 2000, placed his hand on Wanatka's shoulder and smiled. I'm hungry. I'm tired. Emil, all we want is to eat and rest for a few days. I'll pay you well, and then we'll all get out. There won't be no trouble. Don't worry about anything. Okay, fine. The man had no choice. The gangster humored Emil by playing Pinnacle. Wanatka won. It cheated him every hand. It was very friendly. That afternoon, Homer Van Meter sent Pat Riley back to St. Paul, Minnesota to pick up $4,000 from the stash he'd kept for safekeeping with Harry Sawyer. Dillinger asked the gopher to get more ammunition. Now they'd been outed, they might need a bit extra. Pat Sherrington was feeling a bit under the weather and said she would go along to see a doctor. The two Pats headed out after lunch. Emil joined Van Meter, Carroll, and Nelson for target practice outside the lodge behind the help's quarters. They took turns firing a .22 rifle at an empty pickles can set up on a snowbank 100 yards away. The gangsters were amazingly bad at it, and Wanatka easily outshot them all. Or perhaps they tried to ease his mind a little bit. When the rifle jammed, they brought out Van Meter's machine gun and happily blasted away. Meanwhile, Dillinger borrowed a baseball mitt and played catch with Wanatka's 8-year-old son, Emil Jr. Nan was not happy. At all. She was one baseball's throw away from a total nervous breakdown. She'd heard all about J. Edgar Hoover's Operation Make Family Suffer, and read in the newspapers that morning that the G-men had arrested John Hamilton's sister Anna Steve after he and Dillinger had visited her in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. The poor thing was in jail. Nan didn't want to go to jail. Yep, this was exactly the effect Hoover was after. Johnny was nice and all, but then Babyface Nelson joined the game. Emil Jr. recalled, Jimmy was throwing the ball too hard and my hand was hurting, so I quit and walked away. That's it. Nan wanted to get her son out of there. Emil agreed, but they needed an excuse. Nan Wanatka thanked her lucky stars that she had the perfect excuse to get her son Emil Jr. away from the lodge. Her older brother, George Laporte's son, had a birthday party later that afternoon. Nan threw some of Emil Jr.'s clothes in a bag and announced to the gangsters that the kid was expected at her brother's house for his cousin's birthday party. If the kid didn't show up, they'd know something was wrong. Wanatka asked John Dillinger if he could drive him over. Johnny said, sure. Emil Jr. recalled, I remember Dillinger even gave me $0.25 to buy ice cream. That's $5 today. However, Johnny insisted that Homer Van Meter go along to make sure Vanatka didn't say anything smart to anybody. By the time Mr. Vanatka and his shadow gangster returned to Little Bohemia, he'd made a decision. He was gonna warn the police. Emil couldn't call them because every time he used the phone, one of the gangsters hovered nearby to listen in on the conversation. He couldn't sneak out unseen to tell a neighbor, nor could he warn any visitors to the bar. The gangsters wanted to know the names of every person who visited the lodge, and he wouldn't risk the lives of his patrons. He decided it was safest to write a letter to a friend, George Fisher, an assistant U.S. attorney in Chicago. But how to mail it? Well, Nan could go and give it to her brother George at the birthday party and he could mail it. Mrs. Vanatka casually told Johnny she was going to her nephew's birthday party. Was that all right? Dillinger said, sure. Mrs. Vanatka waited for a shadow gangster to be assigned to her, but Dillinger only smiled. This scared the crap out of her. She got into the family Chevrolet and thought Dillinger was testing her. She pulled the choke so the engine kept dying. But when no one came out to help her, she slowly drove to the main road, Highway 51, and turned left. After a mile or so, a car appeared behind her. Probably nothing. She passed her brother George's house. She decided to mail the letter herself in Mercer, the next town over. As she left Manitowish Waters, the car was still following her. She slowed down, and the other driver slowed as well. Oh no! Well, it was everyone's least favorite gangster, Babyface Nelson. Nan thought fast. She would pick up her brother Lloyd Laporte, who lived several miles ahead on the other side of a big S-curve. She slowly drove to the first turn of the curve, then floored it, and raced into her brother's driveway, skidding to a stop. When Lloyd came out of the door, she called out, "Jump in!" Lloyd got in and ducked down while she forded back onto the highway. Just in time, Nelson came around the curve. He hadn't noticed anything. She told her brother she was in trouble. Lloyd remembered the fancy car pulling up to the lodge the day before and joked, "I guess Dillinger is there." Dillinger is there. Call Dad. Nan slipped him a letter and told him to mail it since one of the gangsters was on her tail. In Mercer, she floored it around a corner, slammed the brakes, and let Lloyd out unseen. She drove on to the general store to buy candy for the party. At the counter, Nan saw Nelson pull up on the sidewalk. He glared at her through the store window and pointed a finger at her. A warning. I see you. Nan nearly died. She picked up the candy and left the store. Her brother Lloyd called from across the street, "Hey, Nan, give me a ride." Dang, those are some Oscar-worthy performances right there. Laporte got in the car. He'd mailed the letter at the railroad station. Nelson never saw him. The siblings drove to their brother George's house where the birthday party was in full swing. Nan tried to keep calm and carry on, but when people started joking about Dillinger, she lost it. She called her sister Ruth, her husband Henry Voss, and her two brothers Lloyd and George into the bedroom. So, John Dillinger was staying at their lodge with his gang, but they'd be fine. He just mailed a letter to warn the authorities in Chicago. Voss was like, "It's Saturday, Nan. That letter won't be delivered until Monday. You could all be dead by then." The family considered options. They couldn't alert the local sheriff's office, which was woefully ill-equipped to handle the likes of John Dillinger and crew. Henry figured he could drive to Rhinelander, some 50 miles southeast, find a secure phone line, and call the Chicago police for help. Where they lived, they only had a party line, the norm in northern Wisconsin. A party line was where multiple subscribers shared a single phone line, so anyone who picked up the phone could hear what someone on that line said. They couldn't risk the gangsters hearing their call by accident. George didn't believe in half measures. "Let's organize a posse and storm the lodge right away." Voss was like, "You want a bloodbath? Because that's how you'll get a bloodbath." Nan preferred the call option, but she wanted to discuss it with Emil first. The next morning, Lloyd would swing by the lodge to pick up a pack of cigarettes. If Emil greenlit the plan, there'd be a note inside telling him to go ahead. Nan left Emil Jr. at the birthday party turned impromptu slumber party and returned to Little Bohemia. Neither Nelson nor Dillinger questioned her about the unscheduled trip to Mercer, thank goodness. Nan didn't think she had it in her to give another Oscar-worthy performance. However, Nelson was sure something was up with Nan and her little trip to Mercer. But when he warned Johnny, he told Jimmy he was imagining things. Nelson couldn't let go and creepily shadowed the Wanatkas wherever they went. John Dillinger wasn't entirely oblivious to his curious hosts. He said, "You couldn't whisper your own thoughts to your pillow without Mrs. Wanatka knowing all about it 10 minutes afterward." At about 10 p.m., Emil Wanatka came upstairs and Nan told him all about her family's plans. Her husband agreed it was best to call the police and wrote a note to his brother-in-law. It read, "Henry, you can go to Rhinelander and call as planned. Not one word to anyone about it. Tell them to line up the highways. There will be more here tomorrow, and don't let anyone know where you're going or why. We want to be protected by them as best as they can. Tell them that." The next morning, Sunday, April 22nd, Nan woke up a nervous wreck. She slipped the note in a pack of Marlboro cigarettes, then washed down a couple of aspirin with whiskey. She rarely drank, and it didn't help. Then Lloyd Laporte arrived with their 66-year-old mom. He figured it would make his visit look less obvious. Two gangsters kept them in their sights at all times, John Dillinger and Babyface Nelson. Lloyd casually asked, "Gee, I left my cigarettes at home. Have you got any, Nan?" Nan couldn't speak and simply handed him the pack of Marvels. He took several cigarettes, then nonchalantly slipped the pack into his pocket. Emil appeared. "Lloyd, you look tired. Go in the bar and get a drink." Wanatka handed him the drink and whispered, "Go into the men's room and get the cigarettes by the flush box." Laporte sauntered into the men's room all chill and found a pack of Camels with another note with license plate numbers, plus the gangsters' names. Lloyd now had two notes. If searched, either could be the death of him. He didn't leave right away, but made some small talk with his sister and then left. "Oscars for everybody!" At the Birchwood Lodge, Lloyd handed the notes off to Henry Voss, who drove to Rhinelander. But it was a Sunday, and Henry couldn't find anyone to warn. Finally, he tracked down a real estate agent who was the son of H.C.W. Laubenheimer, a U.S. Marshal in Chicago. The realtor called his father to break the news. John Dillinger was at Manitowish Waters. Send everybody. On April 22nd, at about 1 p.m., Special Agent in charge of the Chicago field office, Melvin Purvis, was enjoying the rarest of rare days off and was just chilling in his Chicago bachelor apartment when the phone rang. It was Marshal Laubenheimer who relayed Henry Voss's message. "Oh, good. Yet another useless 'We saw John Dillinger traipsing around in the woods in northern Wisconsin' tips." Purvis only had 60 men at his command and could only pursue the few leads that seemed somewhat legit. He couldn't wait to hear this. He dialed the number the marshal gave him, Henry Voss's number, who merely said, "The man you want most is up here." "You mean Dillinger?" Voss wasn't going to mention the name over a party line, but Purvis insisted, and Voss finally said, 6 members of the Dillinger gang are at a resort called Little Bohemia, and John Dillinger is among them." Voss then rattled off a list of their car's license plate numbers and names. Promising. "What's the closest airport?" "Rhinelander. But John Dillinger said he'd leave Monday morning, so hurry." Purvis was already running, but not before telling Voss to meet him on the tarmac and wear a handkerchief around his neck so he could identify him. Unleash the chaos. Purvis ordered all on- and off-duty agents to report to the Chicago field office and called Director J. Edgar Hoover at his home in Washington, D.C. to fill him in. Hoover told him to call Assistant Director Hugh Clegg, who was still in St. Paul, Minnesota, investigating the Lincoln Court Apartment shootout, and tell him to fly all available men to Rhinelander. So Hoover put Clegg in charge of the entire operation. Purvis would play second fiddle. At 2 p.m., Clegg chartered a Northwest Airways plane for a whopping 35 cents a mile. When he found a pilot, he, Inspector William Rohr, and 3 agents hustled over to the airport. Special Agent Werner Haney and 3 other agents who weren't too keen on flying grabbed the tear gas guns and would drive the 4 hours to Wisconsin. At the same time, Melvin Purvis chartered a cabin plane belonging to actress Anne Harding and instructed the pilot to have the engine warmed up and ready to go. Additional reinforcements were summoned in a 250-mile radius of the lodge from St. Paul, Milwaukee, and Duluth. Purvis, with untied shoelaces still tying his necktie, ran into the office on the 19th floor of the Bankers Building in Chicago. Over 15 agents had come in under an hour and they were in battle mode, gathering guns, bulletproof vests, and tear gas equipment. Purvis picked 11 men to join him on the plane. The other 4 would drive with the tear gas. An hour later, at 3 p.m., Purvis's flight took off from Chicago's Municipal Airport. He'd landed Rhinelander after a 3-hour flight at 6 p.m. From the airport, it was another hour-and-a-half drive to the Little Bohemia Lodge. The area of the raid was completely unknown, but they'd have plenty of time to scope out the place before the Dillinger gang left. Purvis later wrote, "The men in my plane were like soldiers awaiting the 0 hour, and this was nothing less." But the information he'd received was obsolete. The gang wasn't leaving the next morning, they were leaving that evening. At 10 a.m. that morning, 3 hours before Henry Voss talked to Melvin Purvis, John Dillinger settled his bill with Emil Wanatka. Johnny, as per usual, was generous, paid the $120 bill and tipped another $110. Dillinger was less than thrilled with the not-so-quiet lodge. There was a constant coming and going of people, and that night, Little Bohemia ran the usual Sunday dollar dinner specials, which meant dozens more patrons could swing by, any of them potential snitches. Then the final straw. A local sat down at the bar after lunch and demanded Homer Van Meter had a drink with him. When the gangster refused, things nearly came to blows. "That's it, we're leaving." Johnny told Wanatka they would check out at 6 that evening once Pat Riley returned from St. Paul. The group would like one last steak and garlic dinner at 4 p.m. One John? Not yet gone. Nan's nervous system was about to collapse as she prepared the meal, plagued by many thoughts. Had her brother-in-law informed law enforcement? Would they get there in time? If they didn't, would Dillinger kill everyone before they left? If they did, would Dillinger kill everyone before they died? About 4 p.m., the gangsters sat down to dinner. Just then, Ruth Voss and her daughters parked near the kitchen door and told Nan that Henry would meet the G-men at Rhinelander. Mrs. Wanatka was like, "Shh, the walls have ears, and so does Dillinger eating his dinner a few feet away." Nan needed to get her sister away from the dining room. "We bought so much meat for the weekend, won't you take some?" She pulled Ruth into the refrigerator room and told her the gang was leaving the moment that Riley kid returned. Ruth got in her car and raced to Rhinelander to warn her husband and the incoming feds. Mrs. Wanatka went to the bar to get more whiskey and aspirin. She'd lost count of both, and the liquor was only making her more jumpy. As she put the whiskey bottle back on the shelf, a hand touched her shoulder. "Wah! Oh, it's Emil. Wah!" Babyface Nelson just emerged out of nowhere. Neither had heard him coming. Both fake smiled at the gangster. Nelson just glared at them. That's terrifying. Jimmy didn't trust the Wanatkas one bit. He wanted to follow Nan into the kitchen but changed his mind and rejoined his wife at his table instead. If he had entered the kitchen, he would have seen Pat Riley and Pat Sherrington pull into the lodge's parking lot and alerted the gang of their arrival. However, Riley didn't see the gangsters' cars anywhere and freaked out. Had the gang left without them, or had they been captured? Well, neither. That morning, overly cautious Dillinger had ordered the 2 cars hidden in the garage. But Riley sensed a trap, turned the car around, and drove off. He'd return after dark to snoop around. From her kitchen window, Nan saw Riley disappear. Oh good, the G-men could still make it on time. Oh bad, there'd be a gun battle at her place. She started to regret a few things. After dinner, Dillinger went upstairs to check a road map and wondered what was taking Riley so long. Speaking of road maps, up in the air, Purvis's pilot had only road maps to guide him, and bad weather made the flight really rough. It got so bad that even the pilot got airsick. The plane carrying Assistant Director Hugh Clegg and his men landed a few minutes after 5 p.m. Clegg found Henry Voss wearing, as instructed, the white handkerchief around his neck. Clegg told Henry to draw a diagram of the Little Bohemia Lodge and its surrounding cabins. The lodge was on the very edge of a lake. The lake was only partially frozen, and escape by boat was impossible. The agents only needed to cover 3 sides of the building. With Dillinger and crew not leaving until Monday morning, Clegg figured he had 10 hours to plan the raid. Plenty of time for all the agents en route from St. Paul and Chicago by car to arrive. Since Hoover didn't want any local police involved, they could put up their own roadblocks. Next, Clegg needed wheels. He flashed his badge at a nearby Ford dealership, but the manager told him he didn't have any. Not until a salesman returned, in 2 hours. A little past 6 p.m., just before dusk, Purvis's plane came in for a landing. which was as smooth as the flight over, as in, it wasn't. One of the landing brakes failed, spinning the plane twice, and it nearly tipped over. A crowd of curious townfolk gathered at the airport. 2 charter planes landing in Rhinelander so close together was big news. Purvis put on a smile and told them they were members of a wedding party. Well, these boys sure look hella pissed off to be going to a party. No Oscars for any of you. Purvis ordered Agent Ray Saran to take Henry Voss, drive to the Birchwood Lodge, and scout a possible staging area for the agents. They'd meet him there. Purvis, quite pleased with the smooth operation, continued to unload the plane. Minutes later, Voss's car screeched up the runway, and Henry ran up to tell the agents his wife had arrived to tell him that John Dillinger had changed his plans. The gang was leaving after dinner tonight. You mean like now? Yep. The feds went from 10 hours prep time to 0. For a moment, Agent Purvis felt all hope was lost, but only for a moment. Melvin Purvis asked the runway crowd, still wondering why the wedding guests looked so darn grim, for a ride to the Ford garage so he could confer with Hugh Clegg. 21-year-old Isidore Izzy Tucholsky drove Purvis and 2 agents over in his jet black 1934 Ford V8 Deluxe Coupe. Underway, Tucholsky bragged about his souped-up car with its high compression head, altered rear end, and a top speed of 103 miles an hour. Good to know, son. Clegg and Purvis had a brief meeting. The feds had no time to wait for the dealership's cars to return, no time to wait for the agents en route to Rhinelander by car, and no time to discuss strategies with Hoover in Washington. They needed wheels and luck to get to the lodge in time. They counted their force, 17 men in all. They'd leave Agent Sam Hardy in Rhinelander to coordinate the efforts from there. They figured they needed 5 cars. But the salesmen were still an hour away, so Purvis turned to his driver. "Son, I'll give you $15 to use the car for the night." Izzy was like, "I don't know." Purvis was like, "I'll just commandeer it." Well, that settled it. Purvis promised he'd return it without a scratch. 1 awesome car down, 4 more to go. Purvis ran around the neighborhood and flashed his badge a few times and commandeered 4 more cars. Not as impressive as Tucholsky's coupe, but they had wheels. The caravan picked up the agents, wedding guests from the airport and brought them to the Ford dealership where they did a weapons check. At about 7:15 p.m., the caravan headed out at top speed, but after a few miles, the highway turned treacherous. Recent rains had destroyed the gravel roads. Then, 20 miles into the trip, one of the commandeered cars stalled. Moments later, another car got a flat and drove into a ditch. 8 agents now had to stand on the running boards of the remaining 3 cars, holding on to the car with one hand while gripping their guns in the other. It was snowing. Meanwhile, Ruth Voss told Nan to head over to her place, Birchwood Lodge. Nan asked Dillinger for permission. Johnny didn't care. They were leaving soon anyway. Now where is Riley? The 3 cars filled with G-men screeched up the driveway at the Birchwood Lodge. While the 8 running board agents tried to warm their frozen hands, Nan Wanatka informed Assistant Director Hugh Clegg that as of 30 minutes ago, Dillinger had not yet left the Little Bohemia Lodge. No time to alert anyone, no time to put up roadblocks, they should strike this instant. Clegg gathered all the agents and revealed his 3-pronged plan of attack. Purvis, Clegg, and 4 others would attack the front of the lodge, while 5 agents would go to the left and 5 would go to the right of the lodge to intercept anyone trying to escape. No one covered the lake. It appears like neither Clegg nor Purvis realized the risk they were taking. The feds had never been involved in such a large raid. They weren't trained for massed gunfights, and their track record in regular gunfights wasn't great either. But this was the 4th time they were sneaking up on Dillinger. They couldn't let him get away this time. Everyone got back in and on the cars and crept down Highway 51 with the headlights off in the pitch-black moonless night. Oh, and it was still snowing. Meanwhile, Pat Riley and Pat Sherrington decided to check in on the lodge and drove up from the opposite direction. But the gangster hopeful lost his nerve again and parked the car. Just a few more minutes. The G-men turned onto Nasdar Road and parked 2 cars in a V to block the lodge's only exit, the 3rd car parked behind them. They had arrived undetected. Good. The agents did a final weapons check. It was around 10 p.m., April 22nd, 1934. The federal agents fanned out and walked toward the brightly lit Little Bohemia Lodge. The bulb over the resort's front door cast a wide half-circle of light, as brilliant there as at midday, according to Purvis. It was quiet. Then, the collies, Shadow and Prince, started howling. Purvis was shocked. Henry Voss never mentioned any dogs. This was bad. They only had 2 tactical advantages, 3 times the men Dillinger had, and the element of surprise. Now they'd lost the element of surprise. The agents raced into position to return the inevitable gunfire, but nothing happened. Then, on the porch, in the light, a man appeared. Then, another. And another. Then 5 total stood on the porch. 3 got into a 1933 Chevrolet coupe parked at the lodge. 2 remained on the porch. Uh-oh. The Dillinger gang? The car started and the radio blasted a swing tune. Purvis and Clegg ordered everyone to take up positions and shouted for the car to halt. The men in the car heard shouting, thought there was trouble, and figured they should haul ass out of there. The driver threw the car in reverse, turned its headlights off, backed out of the lot, turned to the left, and headed straight for the agents. The gangsters were trying to escape. Purvis and Clegg shouted orders to shoot the tires. The 2 men plus Carter Baum and Jay Newman put fingers on the triggers of their guns. The radio blared, the dogs barked, and someone shrieked, "Fire!" The 4 Feds fired on the car and ripped the Chevy to shreds with 28 bullets, shattering the glass of the side window. No one hit the tires. The 2 men on the porch screamed something, but their voices were drowned by the rat-a-tat of the guns, and they ducked inside for cover. Finally, the Chevy slammed to a stop, its engine still running, radio blaring, and the dogs howling. The driver's side door swung open. A man jumped out and took off. He disappeared into the trees beyond the cabins. Another man slipped out of the car and slumped to the ground. The 3rd man remained inside the car. The agents relaxed their trigger fingers. They got Dillinger, or at least some of his men, right? Then, gunfire unleashed from inside the lodge. Hundreds of bullets spat from the 2nd floor windows. The G-men returned fire with gusto. Suddenly, a burst of shots came from a cabin a few yards to the right of the lodge. Bullets struck the ground near Purvis's right foot and the trees behind him. He turned to see a shadowy figure unleashing all the bullets. Purvis aimed his machine gun at the shadow. It jammed. He dropped the Tommy gun and pulled the automatic pistol from his pocket. But the shadow was gone. Babyface Nelson. Nelson had been in his cabin packing his bags. Now he could have slipped out of the back and vanished into the woods, but this is Nelson we're talking about here. Of course he had raced out the front to join the shootout. It took a minute for the agents in front of the building to realize their 2 flanks remained silent. Inspector Rohrer on the left side of the lodge saw muzzle flashes on the roof. He yelled halt at the shadow gunman, but instantly drew fire from one of the lodge's windows. The figure slid down the roof at the back of the building and disappeared. The inspector ran to the back of the lodge but stumbled into a deep drainage ditch that had not been marked on Voss's sketch. The agents on the right of the lodge didn't fire either. They were all tangled up in a barbed wire fence, also not marked on the sketch. Rohrer scrambled out of the ditch but saw no one at the back of the building. The man must have fled inside. The moment the shooting started, Emil Wanatka opened the trapdoor in the barroom and ducked into the cellar. He was soon joined by his waiters and 3 ladies, the gangsters' moles, Helen, Marie, and Jean. Meanwhile, trigger-happy babyface Nelson fired a final burst at the agents and then took off in the direction of the lake. The Chevy riddling the Nelson ambush, Rohrer's drop in a ditch, the barbed wire entanglement, and the hundreds of bullets fired from the lodge all happened at once and lasted a minute. Then the G-men realized the fusillade from within the lodge had stopped. So, is everyone dead now? Time to figure out who the man slumped by the Chevy was. Purvis ordered one of his men to get one of the commandeered cars and shine the headlights on him. Agent K.R. McIntyre called out, "We're federal officers, identify yourself." The man said, "I'm John." Purvis yelled, "Hands up!" But the man didn't seem to hear them. He'd been shot 4 times in the right shoulder, but he was also drunk as a skunk. He ignored the orders and stumbled to the garage, where he sat down, took a swig from a flask he pulled from his hip pocket, and staggered into the lodge. The whole scene was so surreal that no one shot at him. Purvis considered tackling him, but then he'd venture into the circle of the porch light, making himself an easy target. John entered the lodge and picked up the phone. He was connected to Alvin Kerner, owner of the Spider Lake Resort a mile and a half south, who was the area's telephone switchboard operator. John mumbled, "I'm at a meal. Somebody's held up the place." John collapsed. Outside, headlights lit Purvis's back. A car came up the long driveway. What in the fresh hell was this? The 2 Pats, Riley and Charrington, finally decided to check the lodge for the gang, blissfully unaware of what was going down. Their radio was also blaring, and they had heard nothing. Special Agent Purvis watched the car coming up the driveway toward the lodge. Damn, danger was everywhere. Several agents were on it and raced toward the vehicle and ordered the driver to get out. Riley's radio was so loud he barely knew what was happening, but armed men running towards them, never a good thing. He slammed the gear in reverse and backed up full speed down the driveway to the highway, and the feds fired away with their Thompsons and pistols. The music drowned out the gunfire, and Pat were simply confused. Riley slowly drove off. What the hell was that? Still, Charrington urged Riley to return and let her out so she could snoop around. She barely made it 2 steps outside her car when she heard someone yell, "Halt!" She spat, "Halt! Help!" She jumped back into the car but didn't close the car door. She screamed at Riley, "Get the hell out of here!" The gangster in training shifted the car into reverse and slammed into a tree, then wheeled around toward Highway 51. His headlights briefly caught Purvis and Agent John Brennan running and firing. They hit the radiator and shattered a window covering Charrington in glass. Riley shoved 2 pistols into Charrington's lap and shouted for her to shoot! Shoot! Then one of the tires blew and the car tilted, but Riley's driving skills kept the car from diving into a ditch. Charrington reached for the handle to close the door, but she fell out on her butt and rolled on her shoulder, splintering it. Riley slammed the brakes, reached over, grabbed her good arm, and yanked her inside. She was bleeding from where a bullet had creased her cheek. For a few seconds, the car was a standing target, but then Riley floored it, racing off on 3 wheels and 1 screaming metal rim. Pat Riley, the young hopeful, had proven himself the man, remaining calm and adopting on the fly. But they needed a new tire, now. The shootout at the lodge had stopped, but the radio in the riddled Chevy was still blaring. No one could see the one remaining passenger well enough to make a move. Purvis and Clegg were sure they had the gangsters surrounded, but they needed to regroup. Purvis called for each agent to shout out their positions. Once everyone was accounted for, Melvin called out to the man in the running Chevy. No response. He aimed his pistol at the car while Inspector Rohr crawled toward it. The inspector reached into the Chevy and checked the unresponsive man's pulse. There was none. Rohr turned off the engine, which finally cut the loud music. He pulled the man's wallet and discovered that this was Eugene Boisneau, a civilian, not a gangster. In fact, all 3 men were civilians. It's what the men on the kitchen porch had been yelling before ducking back inside. The bartenders George Bazo and Frank Traub had shouted, "Don't shoot, they're customers of ours!" This was bad. Really bad. 35-year-old Boisneau was an advisor at the CCC camp. The drunk who collapsed in the lodge was 59-year-old CCC cook John Morris. The Chevy's driver, the man who ran into the woods, was 28-year-old John Hoffman, an oil station attendant at Mercer, Wisconsin. He'd been shot in his arm. Hoffman staggered through the woods until his arm began to seize up. An hour later, lodge owner Walter Powell took the dazed man in. Though all agents were shocked to learn that the dead man in the Chevy was a civilian, 29-year-old Carter Baum took the news the hardest. The married Baum, father of 2, sat shell-shocked in one of the federal cars, holding the war machine gun in his lap, and muttered, "I suppose I've killed an innocent man. I can never shoot this gun again." Well, at least 3 other agents had fired on the Chevy. Who knows who killed Boisneau? At about 10:30 p.m., Agent Purvis ordered Agent Newman to drive to the Vosses Birchwood Lodge and call Agent Sam Hardy in Rhinelander. He should also fill in the local sheriff about the raid and ask for backup. Newman, worried about Agent Baum, asked Purvis if he could take him along. Perhaps taking the agent away from the scene would snap him out of his funk. Purvis agreed, and Newman and Baum left for the Birchwood Lodge in Tucholsky's Ford. Nan's brother, George Laporte, sporting a rifle, stood guard outside his house where Emil Jr. was staying when he heard the first shots. The firing didn't let up. There be casualties. He and a friend, Carl Christensen, got on his Ford and rushed over to the nearby CCC camp to get medical aid. The camp doctor, S.M. Roberts, thought Laporte was pulling his leg, but eventually agreed to take the CCC ambulance to the lodge. Laporte and Christensen followed in the Ford. About a quarter-mile from the lodge's entrance, a tall, thin man stepped up to the road to flag the Ford down. A hitchhiker at this hour? Laporte didn't stop. In Little Bohemia Lodge, Emil emerged from the cellar to help the collapsed John. He discovered the receiver dangling by the phone and found Agent Hardy in Rhinelander on the line trying to reach anyone over there. Okay, so what do we do? Turn on all the lights and walk out with your hands up. Yeah, so when we come out, the feds aren't gonna shoot us? Nah, it'll be fine. That's not a promise, Chief, but alright. Winootka returned to the cellar and told everyone to follow him out. But the three moles were like, nah, we're good, and stayed. At 11 p.m., Melvin Purvis saw several men, hands raised, step out of the lodge's front door. Old guns trained on Winootka, Bazo, Traub, and the wounded CCC cook, John Morris. Not the John they were looking for. Everyone was searched. Winootka told Purvis he believed the gangsters were still upstairs. For some reason, he neglected to mention that their moles were hiding in the basement. Then, behind Purvis, more headlights came up the driveway. What now? It was a CCC ambulance and George Laporte. George told Purvis, "So, FYI, a tall, thin man tried to flag him down on US 51. Homer Van Meter? Maybe." Another car drove up. What now? It was John Hoffman in a borrowed car. He got out, his injured arm dangling at his side, and demanded to know why the hell had he and his friends been shot at. Sorry. He and John Morris got in the ambulance and were taken to the camp hospital in Mercer for treatment. Winootka and his two bartenders stood in the freezing cold dressed only in their shirt sleeves. Emil asked Purvis if someone could drive him to the Kerner's house to get warm coats. George Laporte offered to give him a ride. The feds decided to wait until light and then flushed the gangsters out with tear gas, which was on its way. Meanwhile, G-men Newman and Baum arrived at the Vosses' Birchwood Lodge. They called Agent Hardy and Rhinelander, who told them that a blue-green 1928 Packard sedan had been reported stolen from the Northern Lights Resort in Manitowish. Could it be that one of the Dillinger gang members escaped? An all-points bulletin was sent out for the vehicle. The two agents raced over to the resort and found local constable Carl Christensen, this one with an E. The constable joined them into Tucholsky's car to look for the Packard, but it was long gone. The trio returned to the Vosses' lodge. After Babyface Nelson ran south along the lake shore for about half a mile, he went inland. But the city boy had no sense of direction and spent 40 minutes walking in circles. Finally, he saw a lit home through the trees and snuck towards it. It was a resort run by Mr. and Mrs. George Lang. Nelson simply barged into the house gun in hand and told the terrified elderly couple, "Now, don't get excited. I won't harm you, but this is a matter of life and death. Do what I tell you and everything will be all right." Nelson, hoping to put them at ease, pocketed his gun, sat on their sofa, and gently petted the Lang's barking dog. His cool, calm, and collected act didn't last long. When Mrs. Lang started crying, he growled, "Come on, shut up." He hustled the couple into their 1932 Chevrolet coupe. George had to drive and his wife was in the back. They headed down Highway 51 toward the G-men's headquarters at the Vosses' Birchwood Lodge. But about half a mile from the Vosses' place, the Chevy's headlights died. Nelson noticed a well-lit house 100 yards to the left. "Who's there?" Lang said it was Alvin Kerner, who ran the telephone exchange. And yes, Kerner had a car. Nelson pulled over and shut off the Chevy. Kerner had been rattled by the disturbing phone call from Little Bohemia and was keeping an eye on the highway from his window. He saw a car without headlights parked not far from his house. That can't be good. Kerner went to the switchboard and called the Birchwood Lodge. Agent Newman answered. So, there was a mysterious car parked outside his home. Very sus. Special Agents Newman and Baum and Constable Christensen hopped into Chalsky's Ford to investigate. Newman was at the wheel, the constable in the passenger seat, with Baum sandwiched between them. Just as Alvin hung up the phone, there was a knock on the door. Alvin opened it. Oh, it's just the Langs. But then Nelson slipped in behind them and threatened him and his wife. Babyface now had 4 hostages, and more were underway. George Laporte turned his Ford into the Kerner's driveway and stopped in front of the house. Laporte, Emil Wanatka, and bartenders George Bazo and Frank Trov got out of the car and ran through the bracing cold to the door. It opened before they could knock. Nelson, waving his automatic pistol at them. One of the bartenders said, "Hello, Jimmy." Nelson said, "Never mind the bullshit, just line up against a wall with the rest of them." Wanatka grabbed Nelson's gun hand. "Put that gun down, Jimmy. Those people are friends of mine." Nelson jerked away and shoved him to join the 7 people lined up in Kerner's living room. He needed to beat town and would take Laporte's car and 2 hostages. Emil Wanatka, who would do the driving, and Alvin Kerner, just cause. Mrs. Kerner wailed to leave her husband alone, but Jimmy ignored her and told the 2 men to go outside. Kerner got into the back seat with Carl Christensen, George's friend who had accompanied Laporte to the camp. He was still sitting there, just chilling. So was Laporte's rifle at Carl's feet. Nelson joined Wanatka in the front seat and kept jabbing him with the gun. Emil said, "Why put the gun in my ribs, Jimmy? I'm not armed. What are you afraid of?" "Oh, shut up, but just start the car." Wanatka stepped on the starter. Nothing happened. Nelson said, "You haven't got the switch on." Wanatka turned on the switch. Now the car choked, which infuriated and already agitated Nelson. Then headlights came up the Kerner's driveway. Who dis? It was a little after 11 p.m. when Agents Newman, Baum, and Constable Christensen approached the Kerner's place and saw the parked Lang car on the side of the road. They stopped. The car was empty. Newman told Baum to write down the license plate number and then went up Kerner's driveway to get the 411. Newman said, "Have your guns ready." Christensen was like, "Hey, that's George Laporte's Ford," and there were people inside. Newman pulled up to the right and rear of the Ford, lowered his window, and asked for Mr. Kerner. No answer. Christensen recalled. "We had not come to a complete stop when a man jumped out of the front seat of Laporte's car and pushed an automatic pistol through the open window of our car. He was wild, crazed. Nelson." He shouted, "Who's there?" The agents, thinking the gangsters were still pinned down, actually thought he was one of theirs. Were federal agents? "Get out of the car!" As Newman opened the door and stepped on the running board, Nelson said, "I know who you are. A dirty goddamn bunch of cops. I know you bastards are wearing bulletproof vests, so I'll give it to you high and low." "Damn, son." Newman couldn't reach for his gun. He leaned back in his seat so Baum had a clear shot at Nelson. Baum had vowed to never fire his machine gun again, but this man was no innocent man. This was Babyface Nelson. Baum did not raise his gun. He also leaned back as if to hide behind Newman. He just couldn't. Newman reached for Nelson's gun, then pushed his way out of the car. Babyface opened fire. The first bullet glanced above Newman's right eye, and he fell face first to the ground. He was semi-conscious but started crawling away. Christensen jumped out from the passenger side, but Nelson gave a quick volley and the constable went down in a ditch. Only Baum was left. Nelson aimed his gun at Baum's neck, but angled it downward. He knew what he was doing. The bullet went past the agent's steel vest and into his heart. Baum staggered out of the car, walked a few steps, dropped his machine gun, and fell over a white fence. Nelson kept shooting indiscriminately in all directions. Laporte's friend, Carl Christensen, ducked down in the back seat as Wanatka drove George's Ford into a snowbank. A male slipped out of the car, checked his legs and neck to make sure he wasn't hit, and disappeared into the woods. Alvin Kerner sprinted into his house, while Christensen remained in the back seat, frozen in fear, hunting rifle still at his feet. He suspected that Babyface never even knew he was there. Nelson seemed to have lost his mind. He either reloaded or grabbed another gun and started shooting at everything that moved. He fired at a running Wanatka, then at a ditch in the direction of Constable Christensen, who already had 7 bullets in him. When Babyface finally ran out of bullets and targets, it went silent. Jimmy got into Tucholsky's precious Ford that Purvis had promised he'd return without a scratch, swung it around Laporte's car, running over Bombs Thompson, shattering its stock, and exited the driveway onto the highway. Constable Christensen reached out for Bomb's machine gun, dragged it over, and tried to shoot, but the weapon failed. A semi-conscious Agent Newman fired at the Ford 7 times, but missed. Still, one of his bullets tore into Constable Christensen's leg. Newman thought Bomb and the constable were dead. Newman scrambled to his feet, drew his backup .38 on Carl Christensen still in Laporte's car, and ordered him out. Then the agent limped to Kerner's kitchen door and banged on it, but Alvin feared this was demonic Nelson playing tricks and refused to open it. By now, Newman caught on that Carl Christensen was one of the good guys and asked him to drive him to the Birchwood Lodge. They found the car keys that Wanatka had dropped in the snow and raced off. In the eerie silence that followed, Constable Christensen heard Agent Bomb's last, raspy breath. Nan Wanatka heard the gunfire getting closer and was freaking out. She thought her place would be the bad man's next stop and they'd take her. She convinced her mother, her sister, and niece to escape into the woods with her. When they got to the shore of Spider Lake, they heard shots from the Kerner's place, turned, and ran through the dark woods until they found an abandoned shack and hid. Nan finally had her nervous breakdown. She laughed, screamed, and cried hysterically. Mama Laporte now freaked out and figured this is just the kind of hideout the gangsters would look for. So the 4 women ducked out again and ran deeper into the woods until they collapsed to the ground, exhausted. After some time, they heard Henry Voss call, "It's all over with. Come on back." Nan never quite recovered, always fearing a Dillinger associate would come and murder her and her family in revenge. Meanwhile, the shots from the Kerners could also be heard at the Little Bohemia Lodge, but the agents had no idea who was doing the shooting or why. They just stared at the lodge, waiting for the tear gas to arrive. The midnight hour came and went, and the howling, freezing wind picked up. Purvis had his agents sneak toward the garage in front of the lodge and search it. They discovered 2 cars fully packed with machine guns and luggage. But were the gangsters still inside the lodge? Impossible to know, but Purvis was sure of it. Then Emil Wanatka ran back onto the scene. Agents yelled at him to put up his hands, but he was too out of breath. Purvis didn't recognize the lodge's owner and feared this was some kind of trap. It had been one of those nights. Between gasps for air, Emil said, "All your men are dead at Kerner's." Purvis hardly registered the information and asked him to spell his name and address. Emil was flabbergasted. Hell, he couldn't spell Manitowish waters on his best day. Purvis sent agents to check Wanatka's story, but Emil didn't want to wait. He got Director Clegg to sign off on his plan. He'd pile straw and blankets into the back of his pickup truck so he could check on the dead and dying at the Kerner's place. Agent John Brennan and Inspector William Rohr volunteered to go with him to provide cover. Tucholsky's Ford was long gone, the battery of the commandeered car that had been used to shine its headlights on the civilian Chevy died, and they couldn't find the keys of the second commandeered car. So Brennan and Rohr squeezed in Wanatka's truck. Down the road, Babyface Nelson, flying down Highway 51 in Tucholsky's hot rod, encountered Special Agent Werner Haney in the car full of incoming St. Paul agents. Nelson blinded him with a custom spotlight, another Izzy add-on, and roared past. Haney figured it was a local police officer. The St. Paul agents also whizzed past the 2 Pats, Riley and Charrington. The duo had bought a new tire at a gas station in Mercer, filled the tank, and went merrily on their way, heading north. Meanwhile, Wanatka, Brennan, and Rohr pulled into the Kerner's driveway, and the agents were horrified to find Wanatka had been right. Agent Baum was dead. Constable Christensen was critical, and Agent Newman at the Birchwood Lodge was bleeding but stable. Wanatka grabbed Baum's .45 automatic and drove his body to the CCC camp, where Dr. H.A.A. Oldfield pronounced him dead. The survivors were taken to Grandview Hospital in Ironwood, Michigan. Christensen had 15 bullets in his sheepskin coat and had been hit 8 times in the arms, chest, and feet. A nurse said, "That was a goner," but he made it. It took a while, but Carl Christensen made it. It was almost dawn as Wanatka once more headed back to his lodge where sometime after 4 a.m., a crowd of self-appointed deputies had arrived with weapons and started shooting at the building, as if things weren't confusing enough. Purvis and Clegg talked them out of storming the lodge on their own and kinda marshaled them into service. When Monatka came up the driveway, the firing had not stopped. An 18-year-old boy aimed a shotgun at the lodge and said, "I'm gonna get the award, I'm gonna shoot Dillinger." Monatka yelled that the next one that put a bullet into his house would get hit over the head with his gun. Meanwhile, bad news kept coming. While putting out an APB on Nelson, added on to the APB on the 1928 Packard, Agent Sam Hardy was told that yet another car was reported stolen, a 1930 Model A Ford Coupe, Wisconsin plates 92652. The suspected culprit? John Dillinger. If that, the possible Homer Van Meter sighting, a getaway in a stolen Packard, and the Babyface Nelson massacre were true, then who was even left inside? When Werner Haney and the St. Paul agents pulled up at the lodge, the federal men prepared for the raid. If any gangsters were still inside, more could die. Assistant Director Hugh Clegg got his forces into position to raid the Little Bohemia Lodge. One angry Izzy Tucholsky joined in. He'd just found out that one Babyface Nelson was now in possession of his hot rod. At the break of dawn, 5 a.m., Clegg ordered to fire the tear gas canisters. Two agents raced toward the lodge, stopped, aimed the tear gas gun at the window, and fired. But the canister bounced off a screen and fell to the ground. Another shell was fired, another failure to breach. But the cylinders on the floor deployed, and the wind blew tear gas back at Purvis and the agents, who stood with their guns trained on the lodge's exits. Agent John McLaughlin volunteered to run to the door of the lodge and throw a canister inside. And so it was done. Yay! Success! Now that smoke started billowing inside, some random posse members opened fire. Clegg yelled at them to stop. They did. After the shooting ceased, Purvis heard a voice. "We will come out if you stop shooting." Purvis yelled back, "Come out and bring everyone with you with your hands up." The agents hurried into position and covered the front door, which opened slowly. Finally, a figure emerged from the smoke. A woman, Helen Gillis, Babyface Nelson's wife. Next, Jean Delaney, Tommy Carroll's girl. Then Mary Conforti, Homer Van Meter's girl, with one hand raised, the other one cradling her bulldog, Rex. That was all. No Dillinger, no Hamilton, no Van Meter, no Carroll. Could this be a trap? The abandoned ladies were arrested under assumed names. They were about to experience the G-Man's special brand of hospitality. After more tear gas and bullets, Purvis and 5 agents entered the lodge to arrest the gangsters. They searched the first floor. Clear. The agents dashed outside, crying from the tear gas and gulping for fresh air. Once recovered, they went back inside and searched the second floor. Clear. Then the cellar. Clear. The lodge was entirely gangster-free. Dillinger and crew were gone. Thus ended the battle at Little Bohemia. Not with a bang, but with a whimper, of Purvis standing at the water pump soaking his head, trying to wash the tear gas from his eyes. Agents soon discovered that the lodge wasn't actually butted up against a lake. 30 yards to the back of the building, the terrain dropped steeply to a narrow stretch of sandy beach. That's how the gangsters had escaped. Rewind. At around 10 p.m., April 22nd, John Dillinger, John Hamilton, Homer Van Meter, Tommy Carroll, and their moles were in the lodge's bar playing cards waiting for Pat Riley. When the dog started barking, they didn't even look up. Shadow and Prince had barked at every leaf that moved for 2 days now. But then, gunfire. That's new. Their reaction was instantaneous. Getaway mode activated, Dillinger, Hamilton, Van Meter, and Carroll dashed upstairs and took up their posts, while Emil ducked into the cellar. John killed the light and told the 3 girls, "Better duck." The girls snuck under the bed. Showtime. Moments later, machine guns poked out from the second-story windows, and Van Meter unleashed his weapon first. Then Dillinger, Hamilton, and a few seconds later Carroll on the roof started shooting. They couldn't see a thing beyond the lodge's porch light except muzzle flashes of people firing at them. However, there was a noticeable lack of attackers from the rear, and they were out of there. Dillinger, Hamilton, and Van Meter climbed out of the second-story back window onto a back porch, crept about 25 yards, and slid down the steep bank to the shore of Little Star Lake. Where Babyface turned left, they turned right, as they had previously discussed, and escaped along the shore while remaining hidden by the bank. Obviously, Nelson had not been paying attention when the gang discussed escape plans. Meanwhile, Carroll slid off the roof and landed in a pile of snow, but by the time he got to running and hit the lake shore, the others were out of sight. The trio went inland, got to a road, and saw the ambulance and George Laporte driving up. Homer Van Meter tried to flag them down, but no one stopped. The tall hitchhiker. After Laporte passed, Dillinger and Hamilton appeared from behind the bushes. They needed to steal a car, now. The trio ducked back into the tree line and pushed forward through the underbrush looking for any lit buildings. They quickly found a resort with a truck parked outside. Bingo! Mr. and Mrs. Edward Mitchell, an elderly couple, were talking to their hired man when they heard a knock on the door. John Hamilton asked Mr. Mitchell for a drink of water, then calmly walked across the room and, without saying a word, ripped the phone off the wall. The couple had heard gunshots in the distance and realized that trouble had now walked into their home. Mitchell's wife on the sofa asked, "You couldn't be Dillinger, could you?" Johnny replied, "You couldn't have guessed better." Mitchell said, "My wife is just getting over the flu." Dillinger picked up a blanket and tenderly draped it over her shoulders. He said, "Here you are, Mother. We won't hurt you. You've probably heard stories about me, but I'm not as bad as I'm pictured." Dillinger told her husband, a man about his father's age, "Never mind, old man. I'd never harm a hair on your head. We're looking for a car." Edward Mitchell would later say, "For an outlaw, Dillinger was a gentleman. He made the others behave, no foul language, and cool as a cucumber." Mitchell said his Model T was on blocks in the garage. The truck outside belonged to his worker. Dillinger hustled everyone out, but the truck wouldn't start. Just their luck. Johnny looked around and spotted a 1930 Ford V4 Model A coupe parked in front of a nearby cottage. It belonged to a local carpenter, Robert Johnson. Beggars can't be choosers. The trio headed over. Van Meter shouted until the carpenter opened the door, groggy and wearing bedroom slippers. "Mrs. Mitchell needed a doctor. Hurry!" Johnson ran to his car, where the gangster welcome committee forced him to drive over backcountry roads toward their final destination, St. Paul. Johnson just caught a glimpse of his wife peering out of the window, but she shrugged and went back to bed. Her husband was apparently going out with his friends. The trio dropped Johnson off at the side of the road near Park Falls, Wisconsin, and continued on their way. A minute later, Tommy Carroll, trying to catch up with his fellow gangmates, appeared on the highway near the Mitchells. But they were already gone, and he had to look for his own car. He walked all the way to Manitowish without seeing one. Finally, on the other edge of the village, at the Northern Lights Resort, he saw a blue-green 1928 Packard sedan. Carroll was almost caught by its owner, Henry Cunard, but he made a clean getaway. After a few miles, Tommy came to a fork in the road and chose poorly. Instead of heading on to Mercer, he drove down a dead-end lumber trail. He wouldn't notice for hours. Melvin Purvis and Hugh Clegg retreated to the Vosses' Birchwood Lodge, dazed and confused. It was time to let their boss, J. Edgar Hoover in Washington, D.C. know what had happened. Throughout the night, Hoover had received updates about the actions at the Little Bohemia Lodge. He was now told the Dillinger gang got away. Purvis blamed the barking collies, though they never alerted the gangsters. Hoover blamed the 3 drunken men for not heeding orders they never heard, and some say were never even shouted. The net result of the operation was 1 federal agent and 1 citizen killed, 1 federal agent, 1 local police officer, and 2 citizens wounded, 3 moles in custody, but all the gangsters got away. However, the gangsters weren't home safe yet. Pat Riley had his new tire, but his headlights died and the car got stuck in a mud hole. His injured road buddy, Pat Charrington, talked her way into a room at a nearby farmhouse, while Riley remained at the car waiting until morning for a tow truck. Tommy Carroll realized he was on a dead-end lumber road, but slid the stolen Packard into a ditch some 15 miles from the resort. He had to continue on foot. Babyface Nelson got Tucholsky's precious Ford stuck in the mud only 12 miles away from the Kerner's place and also had to continue on foot. And Dillinger, Hamilton, and Van Meter, trucking along in their stolen Ford V4, were seen by police as they were heading back into St. Paul. The officers gave chase. At the end of all this, one of these gangsters would be dead. Find out in the next episode. See you there.